If, like me, you've got an interest in the concept of ego dissolution and being able to see reality more clearly for what it is, then in this video I wanted to talk about this book by Jimmy T. Kirkbride, which is the Saturn Rising and Into the Void volumes, which I purchased a few months ago and I finished reading. I'm going to go through briefly why I bought the book, which was a little misguided, I have to say. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the book. I'm not going to go into every section of the book, give a bit of commentary on it, and then I'm going to address the issue that I have with ego dissolution, or more, I suppose more accurately, Kirkbride calls it, I will put it on the screen, I won't say it because I'm sure YouTube won't like it, but it's the ending of the ego, the annihilation, the destruction. I know that sounds a lot stronger than dissolution, but I think that is the strength at which Kirkbride is approaching this. So a little story about why I bought this book. I do daily planetary devotions. I recite the Orphic hymns, and on one particular Saturday when I was addressing Saturn, I had a really strange experience. I felt this really heavy energy come over me. It wasn't depressing, it wasn't upsetting. An energy that I guess I would associate with Saturn being a very slow moving entity, just observing what's going on in the cosmos. And it just kind of came down like a blanket on me. And it happened after I'd finished reciting the Orphic hymn, and I was kneeling with my hands at either side of me, and I couldn't move my hands. They were stuck in that position. I couldn't move them. And I had this thought pop into my mind that said, you need to work with Saturn. And it wasn't a great surprise to me that it said that, because if I'm honest, death is a bit of a fascinating and fearful concept for me. Death came into my life when I was a young age. I lost my dad when I was very young, so I was exposed to death very early on, and it left me with this maybe morbid fascination with it. And when I had this experience, I'd heard of Saturn Rising. I'd also heard of the book The Cult of the Black Cube. I wasn't really sure which one to choose, but then I came across the introduction to Jimmy Kirkbride's book online, and I read it, and I really enjoyed his style of writing. It was very engaging, so I thought, right, I'm going to try and find the book, and I did. So I'll just give you a sense of what's in the book. The first part is the Saturn Rising, and then he followed up with Into the Void. Now, I've heard as well that there's a Saturn Rising 2, but I don't know if that was Into the Void and the name just changed to Into the Void, or whether there was a Saturn Rising 2 in the writing process. And unfortunately, Jimmy T. Kirkbride passed away earlier in this year, 2025, so I don't know if we will ever see any follow-up if he was in the middle of that. So some of the bits that stood out for me were the chapter on the correspondences of Saturn and working with Saturn. So plants, metals, incenses, particularly I think tobacco he talks about. Some of the chapters in this book were hard going for me for different reasons. So there was a chapter where Jimmy Kirkbride talks about a particular forest in Japan that is well known as being a place where people go to take their own lives. I suppose this theme of people taking their own lives, mental illness, depression, is kind of weaved throughout the book. And it's really interesting. When I was getting ready to film this video and I was flicking through the book again, I really felt this heaviness come over me again. And I got that while I was reading the book. There were times where I read this book and I really didn't want to. I didn't like the feeling I got from it. And I don't know if that's just because of the subject matter or if that is more of the reality of working with Saturn. But that was a difficult chapter to read. Another chapter that was difficult to read, but for another reason, was about sacred geometry. I just found it hard to understand it. If I'm being honest, that's just me. So I'd have to go through that again if I really wanted to get to grips with it. Interestingly, Kirkbride, he also talks about how our cultures have this need, or this almost like this delusion, that we are immortal, that we can cheat death, that we can engage in activities that will enable us to live forever, and products are advertised to us that give us this idea that we can live longer, and we avoid the fact that one day we are all going to die, whilst at the same time we engage in activities that might actually hasten our death, like smoking tobacco and eating foods that are really not good for us on a physical level. I think if I remember rightly, because it's been a little while since I read the book, he almost talks about that maybe in some ways we have a death wish. We have this need to walk nearer to the edge of the abyss and get a glimpse of death, but not actually want to partake in it. And this theme of not really being in control of our lives, and that surrendering our ego, I guess, is a way of seeing reality for what it is, seeing through the facade and the illusion of reality. And I do understand how surrendering our ego could work. I'm interested in non-dualism, that, we, our bodies, our minds, as they are not really us, but we are, the true us is actually part of the essential whole. I'm still refining my thinking on that, but that's I am interested in non-dualism. So Into the Void, Kirkbride actually takes you through the ritual that you'll be performing to get you to that place of ego annihilation. I'm not going to use dissolution because I think dissolution is a rather soft word for this book. I think it is annihilation. I think it's destruction. There are some rituals you can do, or some exercises you can do, that can give you an idea of what the further path is going to look like. And then if you go on to do the following, then that's the point of no return, he calls it. So you can do so many of the exercises, see how you feel, and then at that point you can stop if you don't want to. And then he will go through the ritual. If you want to go through with the ritual, you shouldn't read a certain part of the book. If the ritual has been successful, he explains what will likely have happened whilst you've done it. So you don't want to read that part if you're going to go through with the ritual, because it might implant some messages in your mind where you then have an experience in that ritual which actually isn't real, but it's more because you've read the part of the book where Jimmy Kirkbride tells you what should have happened. I went ahead and read that bit because as I worked through the book, I realised I'm not going to be doing this ritual. It was just not what I wanted to do, which is fair enough. So let's talk about my thoughts around ego dissolution, ego death. So the first thing for me is that the ego is not all good and it's not all bad. Kirkbride makes a good point that ego has been the reason for some of the most despicable acts that have happened in humanity, and I fully agree. But also ego has been the reason for so many advances in ourselves as species in terms of technologies and the things that we have now that we didn't have many years ago. If it wasn't for the egos of people believing that they could achieve these things, and they imagine and then they created these things, brought them into physical being. I think talking in extremes on either end, that the ego is all good or it's all bad, that's not helpful. I think there's a lot of nuance. Because of that, I don't see that that's a reason to destroy the ego. Maybe there are ways that we can tune into when the ego is showing up for us, when it's being unhelpful, and maybe learning how we can temper our egos a bit better so that we can act in ways that help us to lead lives that are more in service of others, also so that we don't go down a route or take actions that are destructive to our own happiness and to the happiness of those around us. The next point I wanted to make is that whilst I do believe that the ego keeps us separated from the underlying reality, whatever that might be, I also believe it helps us to function in this reality that we're in. We are a self that is made up of our experiences and the beliefs and the stories that we tell about ourselves. Those all form this perception we have of the self, and this perception of self is interacting with other perception of selves. And I don't know how we would function in society if we didn't have the ego. And please, by all means, if you have actually experienced an ego dissolution, or if you know someone who has, or if you've read more widely about this, if you know that this is possible to exist without an ego, let me know. But I just fear that losing the ego, getting rid of it, is actually going to leave us almost like, well, how do we function in this life? Let's just take it as that it's an illusion. We are here in this illusion whether we like it or not. And in my mind, I guess we have to make the most of it. I'd be very fearful about letting go of the ego in case it actually led to me feeling quite disconnected from everything else. Another fear I have around the destruction of ego is what happens to our motivation in life. If we have goals and aims, aspirations, where do all those things go if we lose our ego? Maybe we wouldn't have a need for them anymore. Maybe we wouldn't have a desire to achieve. But then if no one in this world had a desire to achieve and had no aspirations, how would that impact on the evolution of our species? I don't think we'd have got as far as we've got today without it. If I destroyed my ego, would I just give up being bothered about going to work and doing the best I could do? Would I be less bothered about other people and interacting with them? I imagine it would be a very isolating place. Another question I would have is that even if you went through the ritual, could that assumption that you've been successful, can that just be another part of what the ego does to make us feel like we've succeeded at something, that we've done something that other people can't do, that we are better than them, that we are somehow superior? When we think we've attained something, how do we know that it is actually real versus it's another illusion the ego is presenting to us? Again, if you have experienced this, and I haven't experienced ego dissolution, so as far as I understand, it cannot be conceptualized intellectually, it cannot be understood at an intellectual level. It is an experience. So if you have, please let me know. I'm sure that if you've experienced it, it is probably undeniable that you've experienced it and not a sort of a cognitive illusion. I don't want anything I've said in this video to come across as though I didn't enjoy reading Kirkbride's book. I really did. My misinterpretation had been, when I bought the book, I thought it would be about working in Saturn in a way that helped to increase my awareness around death as being change and transformation, death as being not an ending but a changing into something else. And so when I realised that it was about destroying the ego, I was intrigued, and it has intrigued me to go on and read more books on non-dualism and that kind of letting go of the ego, but maybe in a gentler way than is put forward in Saturn Rising and Into the Void. For me, it almost came across as though the ego is something evil and underhand, and it's to be destroyed at all costs. And I don't believe that personally. And I mean, I may have misinterpreted the book, but that's just what I took from it. I believe the ego can be a force for huge good, huge innovation, evolution. It can also be a huge force for evil. But what in this life sits at either end of the extremes? Most things, I imagine, are very much on a spectrum in the nuance. Personally, I would not want to annihilate my ego. However, I am still intrigued to see beyond what my limited human material mind can comprehend. But I don't believe also that seeing the other side, that I could actually stay there. I would come back into this body and in this mind, but perhaps with a different perspective, a different way of navigating life. I'm really grateful for Jimmy Kirkbride's book because it actually spurred me on to really dig deeper into non-dualism, and also how we can get stuck in this cycle of spiritual seeking, which can get a bit like an addiction and is not necessarily good for us at all. So if you want to find out another book that I read about non-dualism and about this kind of danger of getting too much into that spiritual seeking and actually feeling more lost with it, then click on the video that's on the screen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.